All right, we are going to start our lecture here over legal accountability, chapter 44. Okay, so this is a really important thing to make sure that you're proficient at in nursing because we can become legally held accountable for a lot of things. Okay, so this isn't the last time you're going to receive this message throughout the program. So it's important that you understand these concepts as you move through. Okay. So laws. Okay, so what is a law? A law is a binding practice, a rule, or a code of conduct that guides a community or a society, and it's enforced by some type of controlling authority, right? So the basic function of a law is to protect society by establishing acceptable patterns of behaviors. So nurses can use legal principles from the various sources of the laws to guide our actions, minimize our possibility of lawsuits, and promote defensible decision-making, okay? The legal framework that governs nursing practice consists of laws, regulations, and standards of practice. The common theme under this framework is that the nurse is legally responsible for his or her own actions, and this legal responsibility cannot be delegated, okay? That's why there's so many different laws and rules of delegation, okay, and the things that we are ultimately responsible for, right? So the laws are, again, to protect clients and society, to define our scope of nursing practice, and to identify the minimum level of care that can be provided, okay? So what is liability versus malpractice? Liability means that the person is financially or legally responsible for something. Nurses are legally responsible for their own actions, and this legal responsibility cannot be delegated, right? This is the basis for liability in nursing practice. Now, malpractice is one source of legal liability, okay? It means that the professional person has failed to act in a reasonable and prudent manner. If someone is harmed during nursing care, the professional may be held liable, okay? So what are the sources of law? Well, there's a variety of them. We'll start with the U.S. Constitution. So the Constitution establishes 3 branches of government, right? Executive, legislative, and judicial. Each branch has specified powers that are designed to equalize power among those 3 to provide a system of checks and balances, okay? So that's one source of law. So then there's statutory law. So a statute is a law passed by federal Congress or by a state legislative body. So Congress passes laws for the benefit of society as a whole, right? Whereas states use their police power to pass laws to ensure the general health, safety, and welfare of the citizens, okay? The Nurse Practice Act is an example of a statutory law. The legislative body of each state passes those regulations or those laws that govern the profession of nursing, which is known as the Nurse Practice Act. Okay, so that's our Bible. That's what we have to abide by, is the Indiana Nurse Practice Act, right? And then there's administrative law. Okay, remember we just talked about statutory law. Now we're talking about administrative law. So this refers to the laws that govern the activities of administrative agencies. So administrative agencies are created at the federal level by Congress and at the state level by its legislative bodies. As applied to nursing, within each state's Nurse Practice Act, the legislative body created a board of nursing to enforce the Nurse Practice Act. Okay, so think of the board of nursing as the police for nurses, right? That's basically what it is. The Board of Nursing creates rules and regulations that are necessary to ensure compliance with its mission, and that is to regulate the practice of nursing. Okay, and then there's common law. So common or judicial law, this is a compilation of laws made by judges or courts, okay? Also referred to as case law. So common law is based on common customs and traditions. It comes from legal principles and guidelines that judges use to determine the outcome of legal cases. So federal laws that guide the nursing practice. So the Bill of Rights. So this is the first 10 amendments to the US Constitution, right? The Bill of Rights clearly identifies and in many ways limits the role of the government in an individual's life, okay? What else? So the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, otherwise known as HIPAA, right? So HIPAA is important. This was passed by Congress in 1996 for a sole mission to protect health insurance benefits for workers who lose or change their jobs, protect coverage for persons with pre-existing medical conditions, and to establish standards to protect the privacy of personal health information. The last one being the most important one to the nursing practice, right? So under HIPAA's rules, healthcare agencies and their employees must take steps to ensure confidentiality of the patient information and their records. That means that we cannot tell anybody that we know in our personal life or anybody that's not involved in the direct care of a patient, we cannot tell their information, not verbally, not written, not post it on Facebook, not talk about it in the elevator, not talk about it at the cafeteria. HIPAA will get you, and you could be fined for that, right? You can be fired for that as well. Then there's the Emergency Medical Treatment and Active Labor Act. Okay, so this is important. This is important for you to know. The Emergency Medical Treatment and Active Labor Act. This requires that healthcare facilities provide emergency medical treatment to patients who seek healthcare in the emergency department, regardless of their ability to pay, regardless of their legal status, and regardless of their citizenship status. The obligation is that the medical facility must provide medical screening to determine if it is an emergency, and then they must stabilize the patient before they transfer them to another healthcare facility, regardless of their ability to pay or anything else, right? Then there's the Health Information Technology for Economic and Clinical Health, the HITECH Act. Right? So under the HITECH Act data breach notification provision, healthcare agencies are required to notify clients of data breaches without unreasonable delay and within no longer than 60 days. Okay. Then there's the Patient Self-Determination Act of 1991. So this recognizes the client's right to make decisions regarding their own healthcare based on the information provided to him by the healthcare provider regarding the medical or surgical treatment options available. So this means all patients should be able to be provided with the benefits, the risks, and the alternatives to a procedure. That is what considers informed consent, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And the Americans with Disabilities Act, lastly. So this act of 2008, this provides protection against discrimination of individuals with disabilities. A person has a disability if he or she has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities, right? In general, the ADA provides that employers must provide reasonable accommodations within the work setting to allow employees with disabilities to perform their jobs. So here's a clicker check. So on admission to Hospital A, the patient indicates that he would like information about making a living will. The nurse informs the patient that the hospital does not have a process in place to facilitate this. Hospital A is not compliant with the what? The Health Insurance and Portability and Accountability Act, the Emergency Medical Treatment and Active Labor Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the Patient Self-Determination Act. The correct answer is D, the Patient Self-Determination Act. This requires healthcare agencies provide information to patients about formulating advance directives, and a living will is a type of advance directive, okay? State laws governing nursing practice. As you can see, these are in red. That's all I'm going to say about that. Okay, so mandatory reporting laws. So in various states, this requires healthcare workers to report communicable diseases that they may find in their practice, right? So you also have a duty to report physical, sexual, or emotional abuse, the neglect of children, older adults, or the mentally ill, whether you suspect it or you have actual evidence of it. Okay, the intent is to protect people who cannot protect themselves and protect society against the spread of communicable diseases. So that is the mandatory reporting law. Okay, the mandatory reporting law also protects you when you report abuse. In most cases, the identity of the reporter is kept confidential. Okay, then there's the Good Samaritan law. So these differ by state, but they're designed to protect a person from liability for those who provide emergency care to someone who's been injured. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in detail in the next slide. And then the Nurse Practice Act, like we talked about, this is a statutory law passed by each state's legislative body, and it defines the practice of nursing. So Nurse Practice Acts are designed to protect patients and society, define the scope of nursing practice. So that means the things that we are allowed to do and what we are not allowed to do. And that goes the difference between LPNs and RNs as well. And it's also meant to identify the minimum level of nursing care that must be provided to clients. Okay. They also handle credentialing, licensing, and then discipline as well. Because remember, the State Board of Nursing is the one who handles that Nurse Practice Act. And the State Board of Nursing is the police of nurses. Okay. So the Good Samaritan Law. So you need to know this. So the Good Samaritan Law is designed to protect from liability those who provide emergency care to someone in need. Okay. So that being said, if you are a nurse and you are licensed and somebody collapses right in front of you, they have a heart attack and they lose their heartbeat, and you provide emergency care off the clock, this Good Samaritan Law is used to protect you. And it would also be used to protect somebody who was not a nurse who tried to administer CPR. Okay. It is there to protect the people providing the care in an emergency situation. Okay. In order for the Good Samaritan Law to be present or to be active, all of the following elements must be present. So first of all, the care must have been provided in an emergency situation. Okay. The person providing the care did not cause the emergency or injury, right? You didn't cause them to have this heart attack and die. The care is provided voluntarily and the patient did not pay you for it. The person receiving care did not object to receiving care. They didn't say, please don't help me. And the person providing the care immediately has to notify 911. You also are not allowed to leave the person unless you transfer care to an equally competent professional. And emergency care should be provided in a reasonably competent manner. So what that means is, would other nurses with the same credentials in the same situation as you, would they have done the same thing you did? Okay, that's where that question goes, okay? So then other guidelines for nursing practice. So institutional policies and procedures, these are going to be different based on where you work. And typically the policies are, as long as you're following your policy at your facility, typically you're going to be okay. So with that, those policies and procedures usually are more specific and detailed than the standards set by those professional organizations. So like the Nurse Practice Act, right? They describe care that is reasonable, appropriate, and expected in the context of that facility. So you must be familiar with the policies and procedures at your building because they may be used as evidence of a violation of a standard of care, or showing that maybe you have done something to give subpar care, right? Also, the Nursing Code of Ethics, that will guide us in our nursing practice. So our Nursing Code of Ethics, this describes the standards of professional responsibility for nurses, and it provides insight into ethical and acceptable behavior, okay? It describes nurses' obligations for safe, compassionate, non-discriminatory, and quality care while defining commitments to their self, their patient, their employer, and their profession. Okay, that's our code of ethics. And then the patient care partnership, okay? This brochure is available in 8 languages. It explains in detail to patients that during their hospitalization, they should expect high quality care, a clean and safe environment, involvement in their care and protection of their privacy, and help when they're leaving the hospital, and also help with their billing claims as well. And then the ANA, American Nurses Association, Nurses Bill of Rights. This is another guideline for nursing practice. So this is a policy statement that's adopted by the American Nurses Association. And it is used to identify 7 conditions that nurses should expect from their workplace that are necessary for sound professional practice. It provides a framework for employers to understand what nurses need for a safe work environment and to support nurses as they address such issues as unsafe staffing, workplace violence, and mandatory overtime. Another clicker check. So a 15-year-old male comes to the clinic seeking treatment for a problem. The nursing history reveals that the client may have a sexually transmitted infection. Which is the most appropriate initial response by the nurse? A, I will need a list of all the people with whom you have had relations. B, have you told your parents about this situation? C, let's discuss how you feel about this situation. Or D, you will need to practice safe sex. Let's discuss how to use condoms. The correct answer is answer C. Okay, so the nurse must establish a caring and trusting relationship with the client. Discussing the client's feelings is going to provide insight into their knowledge base and the readiness to learn. Because this is a communicable disease, the client can receive treatment. In addition, the nurse must adhere to the mandatory reporting guidelines and report the sexually transmitted infection. The nurse's focus is ensuring the client receives the appropriate treatment. Okay. So our standards of practice. So an important element when we're talking about standard of care. So the standard of care means this is what a reasonable and prudent nurse would do in the same or a similar scenario, kind of like we talked about a little bit more, right? A little bit earlier. So an important element of malpractice lawsuits or disciplinary actions is whether or not the nurse complied with applicable standards of practice. Okay, so in malpractice, attorneys are going to look for several sources of information to identify the standards of care and determine what a reasonable and careful nurse would have done in the same or a similar situation. The sources they're going to use is going to include the Nurse Practice Act, job descriptions, hospital policies and procedures, textbooks, professional standards and guidelines, things like that. So that's our standard of care. Another clicker check. There are no legal consequences for nurses who do not follow the ANA standards of professional performance, as these are not laws. True or false? Drop my cup. So the correct answer here is B, false. So with that, the ANA standards of care are one group of professional nursing standards that define what a reasonable and prudent nurse would do in a practice environment. So in a court of law, a nurse could be found guilty of negligence for failing to do what a reasonable and prudent nurse would do. Okay. So then there's criminal law, right? So federal or state government prosecutes. So criminal law. So this deals with the wrongs or offenses against society. It may result in prosecution or legal action by the state or a federal government for engaging in behavior that constitutes a crime, right? So a crime is a violation of a law as defined by some legislative body, okay? The legislature also specifies the punishments for that crime. So state level criminal laws vary from state to state. They can lead to a fine or imprisonment or death, right? And there's a variety of different kinds. So misdemeanor versus a felony, right? So misdemeanors involve less than a year in jail. They include crimes such as assault, battery, petty theft. Okay, you may also lose your nursing license if you are committed or convicted of a misdemeanor that involves crime against a person that can cause harm to others. Okay, so that's a big deal. You have to report any charges to the nursing board. So that would constitute like a DUI. That would have to be reported to the nursing board as a misdemeanor. Then there's felonies. So these involve crimes punishable by more than 1 year in jail. For example, murder, assisted suicide, rape or sexual assault, stealing drugs or equipment, or something like that. This is where a person is convicted of a felony, you lose your right to vote, you lose your right to hold public office, you can't serve on a jury, and you can't possess firearms, right? So something like homicide would be that. If you get convicted of a felony, you may also lose any or all of your professional licenses, including your nursing license. Then there's a civil law. So this allows for resolution of dispute between private parties, okay? So there is something called a tort, which I think, yes, we'll talk about that on the next slide. So in a tort, which is a civil wrong against another person, The law provides for remedies that are monetary, so money-wise, okay, in contrast with criminal law in which the offender can face jail time. So typically you're just fined, essentially. Keep in mind that a plaintiff is the person bringing suit, and the defendant is the person being sued, right? So different types of civil law, like we talked about, a tort law versus a contract law. So contract law involves a written or oral agreement between two parties in which one party accepts an offer made by the other party. Okay. A breach of contract occurs if either party does not comply with the terms of the agreement. Okay. An example would be an employment contract. Okay. A tort law deals with the wrongs done to one person by another person that does not involve a contract. So a tort is a civil wrong, and there are three types of torts. So you can have quasi-intentional torts, intentional torts, and non-intentional torts. We'll talk about those. So a quasi-intentional tort, this includes defamation of character, slander, and libel. Okay, so with defamation of character, all four of the following essential elements of defamation of character must be present in order for this to be a thing. Okay, so defamation of character has to have these four things. It has to have been false. It's false information. It was made to another person. It was caused to the defamed person. It caused the defamed person to experience shame and ridicule and had a negative impact on the person's reputation. And it was made as a statement of fact rather than as an opinion. All of those have to be there in order to be a defamation of character. Slander, this is the spoken or verbal word of defamation of character, right? So a person is not guilty of defamation of character if the statement made about the other person is true, or if that person has a protection of a privilege, such as reporting possible child abuse. Okay. And then libel, this is a written or published form of defamation of character. Slander is spoken, libel is written, right? Then there's intentional torts. So intentional torts, assault and battery. So an assault occurs when a nurse intentionally places a patient in immediate fear of personal violence or an offensive contract. So an assault is like a threat, right? An assault must include words expressing an intention to cause harm and some type of action. Whereas battery is committed when an offense or harmful physical contact is made to the patient with or without their consent, or there is an unauthorized touching of a person's body by another person, okay? Assault and battery typically occur when there is intent to cause a person fear combined with the offensive or harmful contact. Then there's false imprisonment. So this is the restraining of a person without proper legal authorization. This is why restraints are such a big deal, okay? So false imprisonment, it includes any type of unjustified restriction on a person's freedom of movement. Nurses may be accused of false imprisonment when they restrain patients without their permission or when patients are involuntarily committed to mental health units. False imprisonment can involve the use of physical restraints like a vest or a wrist restraint or chemical restraints, so sedative or narcotics, right? You may restrain a person who poses a threat or harm to themselves or by others for safety. However, you must immediately obtain the proper authorization to continue that restraint. Okay. Then there's invasion of privacy. So this is when a person's right to privacy or to be left alone is violated. This law recognizes that a person's personal life should not be opened up for public scrutiny, and the person has the right to freedom from unwanted interference into his or her private affairs. And then there's fraud. So fraud is the false representation of significant facts by words or by conduct. It can occur through making false statements, falsifying documentation, or concealing information that should have been disclosed. It is intentionally misleading or deceiving another person to act or not act for the personal gain of the other person. Okay, the one committing the fraud. So clicker check. So Trina, an RN on the nursing unit, states to the student nurse, I see you're working with Beth today. Make sure you watch your patient carefully because I think Beth is one of our worst nurses. The student knows that this statement can be considered A, libel, B, slander, C, fraud, or D, invasion of privacy. The answer is B, slander. This is an oral statement to another person reflecting only her opinion that may cause harm to her colleague's reputation. So talking about negligence, this is another tort in nursing practice. So negligence is the failure to use ordinary or reasonable care or the failure to act in a reasonable and prudent or careful manner. In many cases, an expert witness is used to determine the nurse's adherence or deviation to the standard of practice. Okay. There is typically with negligence, no intent to harm is present. You did not intend to harm this person, but your actions caused this patient to not receive the best care. Malpractice. This is to win and recover damages in a malpractice. In order to win and recover damages in a malpractice lawsuit, the plaintiff must prove 4 elements are present. So there is a duty, a breach of duty, causation, and damages. Okay. In other words, with enough evidence to tip the scale in their favor is what you need. But all 4 of those elements need to be present in a malpractice lawsuit. Okay. So what it means, existence of a duty. This is the nurse and the patient together have this legal obligation, right? So a duty forms when the patient is assigned to the nurse or seeks treatment from the nurse, or when the nurse observes another person doing something that could harm a patient. That's existence of a duty. A breach of a duty occurs when the nurse fails to meet the standards of care. So attorneys look at several sources of information like we talked about, and they determine what a reasonable nurse would have done in that situation. Causation. So a breach of duty or deviation from acceptable standards of care by the nurse must be in the direct and must be that direct cause of the injury suffered by the patient. Okay. Causation is usually established based on the testimony of experts such as physicians or advanced practice nurses or other healthcare professionals that can clearly show the connection between the nurse's action or omission of an action resulting to injury to the patient. And then damages have to be present. So in civil cases, the remedy for harm to the patient is typically money. They get money in exchange for this harm that was done to them. Okay. But in those cases, some kind of damage has to be present. So maybe they received a pressure ulcer because you didn't assess their skin. Okay. You didn't mean to harm the patient. You weren't trying to hurt them, but by you not assessing that patient, you have given them a pressure injury. You didn't turn them, right? Didn't check their skin. So common malpractice claims, failure to assess and diagnose. So this is the first step in the nursing process, right? And the failure to conduct an adequate assessment can lead to numerous breaches of duty. Okay. Failure to plan. So the ANA standards specifically require nurses to formulate a plan of care. The plan of care may be written or unwritten depending on state regulations, but it has to be there. Failure to evaluate. So the duty to evaluate requires an ongoing cycle of observing for changes and recognizing the significance of the change, documenting and reporting the symptoms, right? So those all are common ways to get in trouble. So when we're minimizing our malpractice risk, we need to remember the saying, if it was not documented, it was not done. Documentation is one of the most effective risk management tools. Learning and practicing proper documentation is going to be so effective in helping, okay? Because if you wrote it down, again, you could be sued years and years after you provide care to a patient. If you wrote down in detail, in narrative format, whatever was going on with the patient, that could save you years down the road. Also observe the standards of practice. Only practice within your scope by reviewing the Nurse Practice Act and following it as needed. Always use the nursing process. Follow those professional standards. Okay. The most effective methods to practice when within acceptable standards is to use that nursing process, right? This is the decision-making framework for nurses. It guides critical thinking by basing nursing actions on the assessment of the patient. Okay. We want to avoid medication and treatment errors. Okay. We want to report and document accurately. Obtain informed consent. This is where certain procedures require informed consent, which is where the physician actually has to talk to them at the bedside and tell them all the risks and benefits of the procedure they're about to undergo. They tell them that there's all of these risks, there are alternatives, and give them the opportunity to decline care at that time or consent to it. Okay. And then always attend to client safety. Other ways to minimize malpractice risk, maintain client confidentiality, right? We also need to make sure that we are abiding by HIPAA, giving them their privacy, provide education and counseling. We need to make sure that we delegate, assign, and supervise properly. So many errors in practice are based on improper delegation. This is an essential element of practice for the nurse who cannot be everywhere. The nurse must know the elements of delegation and implement them accordingly. This is an easy way to get sued, and it's also an easy thing to be tested on the NCLEX is delegation rules. So you need to be paying attention to that throughout this program. You need to accept appropriate assignments, participate in continuing education in services, and getting additional training as needed, and relaying that information to your supervisor if you feel uncomfortable with your assignment. Observe professional boundaries, observe mandatory reporting regulations, and be aware of the legal safeguards used for nurses. And then another question here. An adolescent in labor arrives at the hospital emergency department with her mother, who states the family has no medical insurance or money to pay for the delivery. What is the first step that the ED staff should take? Should they arrange for an ambulance to transport her to the nearest public hospital? Should she explain to the girl and her mother that the hospital only accepts patients who can pay their hospital bill? Should she examine her and determine whether her condition is stable or whether she requires immediate medical attention? Or should she inform her that she will need to transport her daughter to the nearest public hospital? The correct answer is C. When a client comes into the ED requesting examination or treatment of an emergency medical condition, including labor, the hospital must provide stabilizing treatment, okay? This client cannot be transferred until they're stable following that act, right? All right, that concludes our lecture on legal accountability.